Hello and welcome back to Foreign Correspondents. It's the second week of December. I'm Moon Gon-young, and joining me in the studio today is a special panel of foreign journalists and experts. Welcome all to the program.
Good to be back.
Hello.
Thank you.
Now, 30 years ago in 1989, Berliners from the East poured through the wall that had divided them from West Germans for 28 years. Within a year, the two Germanys had unified and the Cold War in Europe had ended peacefully. 30 years later, what kinds of lessons can a divided nation like Korea learn from the German experience of 1989 and 1990? On this week's edition of Foreign Correspondents, we sit down with our panel of experts and journalists to look back on the fall of the Berlin Mauer and what lessons Korea can learn from the German experience. Now, some of you were on the ground there, living through the fall of the Berlin Wall. Others, including myself, were watching this in shock in various parts of the world. Tell us, what were you doing at that time, and what did it mean for you? I'm going to start with Stefan.
Yes, my hometown was 50 kilometers away on the western side of the inner German border, and it took a couple of days longer than in Berlin. So it was not November 9th, but 11th or 12th, when actually the gates and the fence opened close to where I lived. And I remember those days because it was very emotional, and actually nobody went to school. We went to the border to greet the countrymen, the East Germans that poured into West Germany to check the places they could not visit for such a long time.
Christian, your experience?
Well, if you ask me for the 9th of November 1989, I would say every German who was born before 1980 does know exactly, even today, where he was when this news came in. I was a student in West Berlin, came back from the university, saw that on TV, listened to the radio, and we did not understand what was going on when Günter Schabowski from the Central Committee said, well, the wall is going to be open, travel will be easy from today on. So as we did not understand what was going on, my girlfriend and I decided, having a multiple entry visa for East Berlin, to travel into East Berlin to look what was going on. And what we found at the checkpoint was nothing. So there was no border guard. We were the only ones in West Berlin who had this idea. We were standing there for 30 minutes or so, and then we went to the Brandenburg Gate. And I ended up in also dancing and cheering on the Berlin Wall. It was a very, very short night. We went into bed at 6 o'clock in the morning. At 8 o'clock, it rang at my door, and friends from East Berlin came to visit us that very morning.
So from the footages of 1989, that day, we could maybe perhaps find you among the crowd dancing.
We were quite many. But,
right.
Well, if you look very thoroughly, maybe.
But what about you guys? I mean, you were watching this monumental moment in various parts of the world. Frank, what were you doing? Where were you? What were you thinking?
Well, I can't remember exactly what I was doing, but as a university student over that time, I had been a student of basically the Cold War. I was a political science student a little bit and into the 90s as well. So looking at that period and looking at what happened that day, that was an entire shift that took place in terms of the geopolitics of the planet. And now when we look back on it, we say, okay, that was the time when really, that G2 world, that Soviet-American dynamic changed forever.
And
you were closer to Germany than Frank, I suppose.
I was in France. I remember not the evening, but the morning after. I was a kid, and I remember in the morning, my parents were always listening to the radio, and when the news, the news was coming down, and my parents freezing, and I could feel like something was happening, even if I was just a kid. It was not news; it was history happening, and this moment is still vividly remember.
Now, what did the Berlin Wall symbolize to the German people prior to the unification?
Well, I think it was much more than just a boundary. It was the separation of blocks, of systems, separating people. That was a very harsh, a very clear line of separation, actually. And even though the 9th of November came basically out of a sudden for the fall of the Berlin Wall, still it was obvious for the weeks and months before that something was going on. There was a special vibe one could feel, especially in the late summer of 1989, when Hungary opened the borders and East German refugees could get out. That was a very significant point. And I remember even in school, then East Germans were coming into our classes, 1 or 2 here and there. So we knew that something special was going on and that something major might be happening. Of course, nobody predicted the fall of the Berlin Wall for that date and that moment.
When the Cold War's most notorious armed border opened overnight and was torn apart in the days that followed, it was at the most basic level, at least, the wondrous result of human error and spontaneity by, of course, Mr. Günter Schabowski during a press conference when asked whether the ease of travel restrictions would take effect. He stumbled and said, well, now? Immediately? Now, in your view, what were the main factors that led to the fall of the Berlin Wall? I mean, leading up to 1989 and subsequently the unification in 1990?
Well, I mean, there was a range of factors that actually combined and made it possible. Is the flow of information, of course, towards East Germany. I mean, the bankruptcy of some of the countries of the Warsaw Pact at the time. And of course, it was a people's movement. There was this very strong bottom-up movement. It started earlier in the mid-80s in church groups, and people could visit each other. That was part of West Germany's policy to have people meet, to have inter-exchange of church groups, sports teams meeting. There was a German sports calendar. So they tried to have it as concrete and as precise and as much down to earth and down to the people as possible. And if one compares it to the scenario on the Korean Peninsula, it would mean, of course, having people to meet, I mean, the relatives to visit, and enabling people to meet compatriots from the north whenever the occasion permits.
Right. We talked about how suddenly, like Frank said, how unexpectedly the fall of the Berlin Wall came. Then it brings me to the question, were the two Germanys ready economically, socially, politically, in whatever way possible to reunify? Or was it poorly thought out? I mean, was it just like bang in the face and then deal with it?
I think we Germans, we did not have any plan. We did not have any strategy. There was nothing thought out. But maybe this is, looking back to that, one of the very strong points, because we had to react very flexibly. And of course, we also had something like a Ministry of Unification. But if you had gone there on that very night of the 9th, from the 9th to the 10th November, you wouldn't have found any plan in any of these desks. They did not exist, although we had decades of time to think of it. And when you are in Korea, of course, you have many of these conferences where people think of what might be and think of scenarios and all that. We didn't have anything.
So do you guys think that such a scenario, such a sudden collapse, so sudden opening of the DMZ, let's say, is a possibility on the Korean Peninsula now?
I mean, what strikes me when you read about the fall of the Berlin Wall is how the East German leadership gave up without a fight. Something is striking me because I don't see how the Kim regime now would do the same. I mean, they want to stay in power. And maybe it's a question for you, like, how do you explain that they gave up so easily?
It's a good and it's a very important point. I think there are various reasons for this, but there's at least one that has not been touched upon too much. I mean, West Germany was a democracy, same as South Korea, and we had the rule of law. And those in charge in East Germany, I mean, they knew that. And they knew that if they behave according to international regulations, if they obey to a certain standards, if they do not use violence against the people, ask for the army or the police and the barracks, and I mean, it's to go to the streets and run up against the demonstrators, they might likely have a chance in a new country, a new system later. So this was a very important message. I mean, the judicial system took care of the prosecution, the courts of those criminals of East Germany, of those who committed crimes, those who shot at the border, those who ordered to shoot, and those who were responsible. But still, there was, even with the judicial system, but also regarding the political approach of all this, there was a balancing, and there was a clear message to those that they have a second chance. And maybe for other scenarios and settings, this could be an important message.
And I think we need to look at a couple of other issues, and that's the other powers, the great powers involved. There was quite a bit of support for German unification, especially in the United States, that was instrumental in enabling that to take place, and also relationship between the Soviet Union and East Germany was a little bit weaker perhaps than it could have been in terms of putting down those demonstrations. And when we look at North Korea, I think the military has a much stronger political role perhaps than it did in East Germany. And so seeing that kind of laying down of arms and relinquishing of, the use of violence in terms of some type of, potential collapse or something of North Korea might be a little bit more unlikely.
Now, in a survey conducted earlier this year, 7 out of 10 Germans said that they were satisfied with the outcome since reunification. What are some of the biggest changes that have been brought about to the lives of ordinary Germans since the reunification? Christian, maybe you want to tell us about that.
Yeah, maybe I just start with day by day. I think 1 year after the West German mark, the West German currency was introduced, you hardly could see any old East German cars in the street. So what they did, first of all, they did enjoy goods. They had seen that on TV all the time. They knew our advertising TV much more than we West Germans did. And when we came there, they always asked us for brands and told us, well, why didn't you bring this and that? So now they were in a situation where they could enjoy it all themselves. They could travel to Paris. They could travel to the United States. And just met one guy last week who was 16 when the wall came down. And he said, yeah, next year I was an exchange student in the United States. And for us, it was just wonderful. So these were the most important things. But we must not forget that many, many people also lost their jobs in the next years and went through a very, very hard time. Most of the families, and of course, when you worked for state security or whatever, you had to invent for yourself, or you had to face the fact that you might be punished for what you had done.
In a speech delivered earlier this year, German Chancellor Angela Merkel emphasized that there were still work remaining in Germany's reunification process. For instance, for those living in former East Germany, many still identify themselves as East Germans rather than simply Germans. 30 years later, I mean, looking back, is there still a gap between the East Germans and the West Germans? Is there still a stereotype that runs throughout the country that perhaps labels the East Germans as second-class citizens, because some say that they feel that way?
I think it really depends on the generation. For the younger ones, it's basically gone. For the older ones who were not on the winning side, to some extent affiliated to the system of East Germany, of course for them it's a greater hardship. But the younger generation, I remember my military time in the very early 90s, and there it was still a problem. If I was from the West and an eastern small city, and to cooperate with those from the eastern side, that was still a problem. But later on in the 90s in the university, and the first terms, they asked me, hey, where are you from? Or we ask each other. That vanished quite soon. So today, nobody cares anymore where one is from. So that's a big point.
If I just may say one more sentence about the second-class citizens you were mentioning. We have to admit that some of them felt patronized by the Westerners coming, wanting back their own property, for example, but also when it came to the transformation of the companies from a socialist system to a market economy system. This had also had to be organized very, very fast without having any experience before. And you always have to keep in mind these individual stories. If you lose your job, if you used to work in a company with 20,000, with a staff of 20,000, and in the end there are 3,000 remaining, or it's removed completely from the scene, this does something with the families. And so I think these were the fields where many East Germans felt, well, this is something like a takeover. So many of them went through very, very hard times. But from today's perspective, I would say, yeah, well, there has been achieved a lot positive.
Now, why do you think this is difficult for instance, this cohesion or integration by North Koreans in South Korea seems more difficult than what's been described by the Germans? I mean, just think of North Korean defectors who still say that they are viewed as second-class citizens. They don't get employed if they write that they're from North Korea. Why do you think that there's a difference?
Well, I think that, you know, the two countries, their separation is in Korea is a little bit stronger. As our colleagues here mentioned, there was quite a bit of communication. There was travel from West Germany to East Germany. The Korean divide, I think, is much more definite. And I too have witnessed the same sort of anecdotal experience that you mentioned in interviewing North Korean defectors and having them say how they sometimes now hide the fact that they're North Koreans because they get that barrage of sort of intrusive negative questions about why did you come to South Korea and things like that. And then, you know, even within the media, they see that kind of prejudice repeated. And it is somewhat offensive, and I think it has to do, again, with the strength of that division relative to what you have.
Fred, you want to say something?
Yeah, what I can observe now in Korea is that many, not all of them, but many South Koreans tend to look down on North Korea. They tend to think that North Korea is a very backward country and that North Koreans sometimes they consider as lazy or not well educated, or there is language problem as well, that like the language difference are growing. And, you know, I went to North Korea several times as a humanitarian worker in the past. And when you speak with North Koreans, I mean, North Korean people are very proud. They think they are the real Korean. They think themselves they are superior than the South Koreans. And I'm really worried if someday there is an unexpected unification of what happened in Germany. I really expect major clashes. Because if South Koreans go to the North patronizing, say, okay, now we will tell you how to organize your economy, how to organize your companies, how to organize your society and your welfare systems. North Koreans won't take it that easily because they are very, very proud people. And
Right.
there's a lot of preparatory work has to be done in advance.
South Korea, of course, recognizes the diligence of the North Korean people, the intelligence of the North Korean people. We always talk about how when there's a reunified Korea, it'll be a win-win for both because we'll see a shoot up in the economic growth. South Korea's capital plus accompanied by laborers from North Korea who are intelligent and diligent. But many South Koreans do feel that the necessity and desire for eventual reunification also believe several important preconditions must be fulfilled. Now, as resident representatives of your respective organizations, Christian and Stefan, you guys work on projects related to or with North Korea, which make you frequent visitors to North Korea. Can you compare and contrast the North Korea that you've experienced in recent years to the East Germany in years leading up to 1989?
I don't think it can be compared in all the respects. The setting is different from what we had 30 years ago in Europe. But again, there are similarities, and I do think that gives hope. For example, the surveys here, especially among the younger generation, usually end up in the result that the majority of the younger ones are not interested or are not really in favor of unification and so forth. It was exactly the same thing in Germany in the mid-80s, for example. So, and then when it happened, there was a big emotion and there was a restart of the nation. So there is good hope that whenever this dynamic starts to happen, whenever there is a setting or a scenario that things dramatically change, that there can be this kind of new evolve and common understanding and much bigger interest than before.
Do you think the difference between South and North Korea and the gap in economic gap or in individuals, the gap is bigger here than in Germany's case?
Not necessarily, because when it takes time maybe, but they're all Koreans. I mean, when we travel with German delegations, we sometimes have South Korean nationals on our delegation. And it's obvious to see when we are there for a week, let's say, that there's a certain amount of distance at the beginning. But it eases up, and I mean, on day 3 and 4, and the farewell is quite warm-hearted. So I do think that there is this kind of room for hope that things eventually, I mean, nobody knows when, but that there is, if the scenario would be there one day, that things could develop in a positive way.
I think it's curious that you mentioned some events that changed the public opinion, the youth opinion in Germany, and I think we saw a kind of event here in South Korea when you had that first summit between Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in, and that kind of generated, when people heard him speak, and when the North Korean leader came here, and that kind of generated, certainly in South Korea, I think, greater interest in North Korea and greater interest in unification, even if it was only a bump that seems to have receded a little bit recently.
In terms of economic gains, I briefly mentioned how one Korea, a unified Korean Peninsula, many forecasts would be, a lot better in economic growth. What do you think the Korean Peninsula as a whole could gain economically if the two Koreas were to reunify, Christian?
I think it could gain a lot, and some people tend to say, well, the South, or in our case the West, always invests, pumps in money in that. No, it's also a market, and if people tell you that the West did not benefit, even in the first years after the fall of the wall and unification, don't believe them. There were huge benefits among West German companies, of course. This is also a field where some people felt patronized, of course, when they came in. But we must not forget that that the East German economy was not competitive at all. There was nothing they could compete with in comparison to the West German products. And even the East Germans wanted to have West German products. So, and this is the point where you have to consider then that you have to reorganize and restructure everything. And it's not an investment from one side to the other. I think it's a process, and we should see it like this.
Do you think the Koreas are ready now?
For
reunification, if it were to happen tomorrow, next week?
You're never ready for that. I think so. The Germans were not ready for that. But then the wall came down, and I'm very sure we made the best possible out of it. But you cannot foresee that. And if you had asked, don't forget that in the very beginning, after the fall of the wall and the opening of the Iron Curtain, there was even in the German government a plan which existed maybe for 4 weeks to make a process out of it, a 5 years, 8 years process to finally come to a unification. It took us 11 months all in all, because all this develops its own dynamics. You cannot foresee what will happen and how things will develop.
11 months is all it took? Wow, that's surprising too.
Well, from November to the 3rd of October, this is 11 months.
So this is our signature question of our foreign correspondents. If you were to summarize today's discussion into a news headline, what would it be? Frank, you want to start?
Never ready, but, could happen anytime. Unification.
I think my headline would be a question. Can German reunification still be a model for Korea?
Stefan?
Well, even if unification seems to be somewhat far away, never forget the people living in the north.
Christian?
Yeah, maybe expect the unforeseeable would be a nice headline. Or if I had to write 2 articles, maybe something like unification needs much more than 1 generation.
They're very good headlines. I think you should be a reporter. Expect the unforeseeable is what I choose for today. And that brings an end to our discussion on the fall of the Berlin Wall and the prospects of Korean reunification. But I will be back next week with the latest making headlines in Korea and across the globe. So don't forget to tune in then. Thank you for watching and bye-bye.